At some point in the middle of the movie, the lake where they get their water from dries up. And the reason the lake dried up is because the humans have built a dam further upstream. The animals can't see this dam, but all they know is that their source of water, their source of life, has dried up. And so the king of the animals, who's a lemur, ironically, he's like this tiny little animal, he's the king over all the animals, King Julian, he appoints a subcommittee of animals to dig in the lake to find out if they can get to the water, to find out if they can fill the lake again. And so there's this subcommittee of animals that's digging. And the king comes past them at one point and he asks them, "How's it going, guys? Have you found any water? Have you had any luck?" And they look at him and they say, "Sorry, king, unfortunately no water. All we found while we were digging was this big pile of junk." And then the camera pans across to this huge pile of gold and silver and gems and jewels and diamonds that these animals have found. And it's an amusing moment because, of course, the animals don't really understand the value of what they found. They're so busy looking for water, they don't understand the value. Now, I want to talk today about what God has to do with banking in the context of this idea of value. Because how we understand value, how we ascribe value, how we buy and sell debt and equity, how we deal with deposits and interest rates and risk and all of these things in the banking sector, all really comes down to value. It comes down to what we value, and more importantly, what we can get other people to agree with us is the certain value of things. So I want to talk about three things: capital growth, intrinsic worth, and net present value. All right? Now, I need to disclaimer all of this. I'm not a banker by training. I am qualified in some economics. I've done some macro and microeconomics, and I've done a little bit of finance in my time. And as a lawyer, I did a bit of corporations law and practiced in some commercial law, but I'm not an expert in the banking sector like many of you will be. So I'm going to use these three concepts that I'm sure are very, very simple, very basic concepts for you. And being a lawyer and a political advisor, I'm likely to probably misunderstand and misconstrue some of these concepts. So please forgive me for that. But they're going to go towards a bigger point that I want to make in the context of banking. You know, what Standard Chartered and what all of you do in the bigger picture, and what God has to do and God has to say with that. So, capital growth, intrinsic worth, and net present value. So let's start with capital growth. And I want to start really with the origins of banking as we know it, the origins of the banking sector. So you can look back through human history, and there are examples, documented examples that we have in pretty much every ancient empire, right? Whether it's the Ming Dynasty in China, whether it's the ancient Egyptians, the Aztecs and the Incas in South America, the Egyptians in Northern Africa, the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. You have glimpses of this concept of banking coming through. People ascribing value and worth to things, and people understanding resources as capital, because that's really all capital is. Capital, defined in its simplest sense, is assets that are directed to a purpose, right? And the idea of capitalism, which is the system of economics and government that we now live in, is taking capital, whether it's land or labor or money or debt, taking some form of capital, and from it generating wealth that has a value that exceeds the value of the capital that you started with. That's all profit making is. That's all capitalism is at its most basic level. So when we look through history, many civilizations had this idea of understanding that we need to use capital in the most efficient way possible if we're going to generate wealth in the most optimal possible way. And so how this really took legs in the way that we currently see it in our market democracies at the moment is with not just Adam Smith, but people like Adam Smith who were writing in the 16 and 1700s about the concept of the free market and the free movement of capital. Because what became clear, while capital was being used for many thousands of years, the idea that really took hold in the 16 and 1700s, with the beginning of the industrial revolutions, three of them that kind of came in three waves of industrial revolution, is for us to maximize our wealth creation, you've got to allow capital to move freely. Capital's got to be able to move as freely as possible. And this is what Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations. His idea of the invisible hand of the market. Just let the market flow and resources and capital will be distributed and utilized in the most efficient way. And when markets are working well, that's exactly what happens. You see resources being used in in the most efficient way. And no one really has come up with a better way of distributing or allocating resources other than free markets, the free movement of capital. So Smith is writing these things in the 16 and 1700s. They're principles that we've been thinking about and working with for many thousands of years before that, but with Smith's work and then the Industrial Revolution, we have all kinds of things that boost this kind of free market thinking. Things like the invention or discovery of electricity, the discovery of oil as a source of energy, the invention of the printing press, steam power, eventually the internal combustion engine in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, air travel. Then after the Second World War, the integration of the global economic and financial systems, trade liberalization, and then globalization from the 50s and 60s and 70s onwards, into now where we probably have the freest movement of capital than we've ever had in human history. Probably the only aspect of capital we don't have completely free movement of, or close to free movement of, is the movement of people. Right? I can vouch for that myself, because when I moved to Singapore, the visa form just to come and live here for a couple of years was like 9 pages long. So all other capital moves pretty freely, but we're still a little bit restrictive on where people go and how they go, which is probably not an entirely bad thing. Because otherwise, you'd get huge waves of people coming to very concentrated parts of the world. But broadly speaking, capital is moving all over the place, and we have been able to lift more people in real and relative terms out of poverty because of this free movement of capital. Because capitalism and banking have emerged as these huge driving forces and catalysts to be able to unlock potential, unlock wealth, unlock the capacity of capital. Right, so that's a very quick and dirty and kind of overly simplistic summary of how we got to this idea of capitalism. Now, where it goes from here, who knows? Because there's many other isms that have been flagged on this journey that other people have tried. But capitalism seems to be certainly the dominant system of economic and political organization that we have today. And the banking sector sits at the heart of that. Because ultimately the banking sector helps to facilitate, catalyze, and determine that movement of capital. And it does it primarily with regards to 3 things: money, debt, and equity. That's all banks are selling and buying in the end. If you take any product that a bank buys, they're selling one of those 3 things. They're selling equity, they're selling debt, or they're selling money, or they're buying equity, debt, and money. So everything else, all of the other financial products that we've come up with, or even all the fancy stuff, even the derivatives and the secondary derivatives, and even digital currency, like Bitcoin that we think of now, it's all still selling or buying one of those 3 things, either money itself, or debt, or equity, the ownership of something. So what does the Bible have to say about all of this system? Because you often hear Christians saying one of 2 things: that money is evil, that capitalism is evil, that we all need to give away everything we own and we all need to live simply, and wealth is a dangerous thing. Or you hear them say that money is everything, and if you become a Christian, you'll have heaps of money, and money's the marker of success and the marker of value and the marker of work. And if you want prosperity, just become a Christian. Whereas if you look honestly, you don't have to look very carefully, you just have to look honestly at what the Bible actually says about banking, about wealth, about capitalism, it becomes quite clear very quickly that both of these 2 things are wrong. They're both quite incorrect, both of these 2 extremes. Because we see from the mouth of Jesus himself his view of capital and capitalism. And there's lots and lots of stuff in the Bible, specifically in the New Testament, about the importance of the free movement of capital, about personal responsibility, about our responsibility to work hard, to generate wealth, to improve the quality of life of our family and those around us in our community. And probably the best and core one is a story that Jesus tells called the parable of the talent. Parables are just these stories that Jesus told to get a deeper message across. And he tells a story of this wealthy landowner who gave different amounts of capital to 3 of his servants, 3 of his employees. One of them got the equivalent, say, of 10,000 Sing dollars, one of them got 50,000 Sing dollars, and one of them got 100,000 Sing dollars. And then the landowner went away and he said, do what you can with this. He came back. The guy who had 50,000 and 100,000, they both made more money out of this capital. Whereas the first guy was really risk averse, and even though he only got, say, $10,000, he just buried it, literally buried it under the ground, the equivalent of putting money under your mattress. He did nothing with it. And when the master came back, he reprimanded and condemned the man who was lazy with his capital. He condemned the guy that didn't embrace the capacity of that capital to generate more wealth. Right? So it's very clear, if there's any uncertainties, whether you're a Christian or not in the room, that the Bible affirms capitalism. This is one of the core texts, and there are many more, that shows that Jesus himself is affirming the responsibility that people have to use the resources they have been given, whether it's our familial resources, our intellectual resources, the educations that we've got, the money that we've been given, to put that all to good use for ourselves, for our families, and for our communities. Jesus is very, very clear on this. So the Bible affirms capitalism. But here's the interesting thing. It does that in a few places, but then underwriting that affirmation of capitalism is this enormous declaration of the importance of moral consciousness that the Christian scriptures wants us to bring to our capitalism. Because one thing we all know about capitalism and about free markets is that they are amoral. They're not immoral, they're amoral. So there's no moral consciousness that flows into markets. Adam Smith is very clear on this in The Wealth of Nations. So markets can be used for good or evil. And we know if markets are left completely unchecked, a few things will happen that are not morally desirable things. We know that inequality will end up growing because perfect free markets assume in their structure that everyone has equal intelligence, everyone has equal opportunity, everyone has an equally safe upbringing and an equally well-resourced education. And we know that's not the case. So if we let markets just rip, assuming everyone has the same starting point, we know we're kidding ourselves because not everyone does have the same starting point. You know, I might work just as hard as you, but that other person might, have come from a broken home, might have suffered from sexual abuse, might have parents that spent money on alcohol instead of their education. And so while we're both working equally as hard, we don't have the same life outcomes. So this idea that often comes actually from our Eastern cultures, whether it's through the Malayan Peninsula, Singapore, the Orient, Japan, the subcontinent, the Middle East, we mythologize this idea that if you work hard, you will do well. There's actually absolutely very little proof of that in a global sense, in a macro context. If you work hard, you will obviously do much better than if you didn't work hard. But to take any two people and say if they both work the same, they will have the same life outcomes, we know is not true. Because free markets are amoral. And so what the Bible says, it says we have to be careful of the injustice that can come out of capitalism, the injustice that can come out of banking purely for profit's sake. So if we have our eyes only on profits, we lose sight of the impact of our banking, of our economics, of our markets on individuals. And so there are many, 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 countless examples in the Christian Bible which talk about the need for people to be conscious of the impact of what we do on other people. There's lots of stuff in the Old Testament. There are entire books of the Old Testament written by prophets exclusively for the purpose of talking about and condemning people who are wealthy and working hard and oppressing people who are poorer and don't have the capacity either to work hard or to engage with the economic system. And then Jesus himself, the ultimate golden rule, if you like, that Jesus sets down. This is the only place anywhere in human history you find this, to love others as you love yourself, to treat others as you would wish to be treated. That's actually unique to the Judeo-Christian worldview. A lot of people make these interesting claims that, all religion's pretty much the same, it's all about being a good person. No one can point me to anywhere else in any other religious scripture that says anything like this golden rule of Jesus. The closest I could find in my 2 years of studying all of this at Oxford was Confucius, who said, don't do things to others that you don't want done to yourself. Which is close, but still not the same. Because that's just effectively saying, don't do bad things to other people, because you don't want them done to yourself. But what Jesus actually said was, you have to love other people even when they do bad things to you. You have to pray for people and love them even when they hate you. You don't find that anywhere else. So the Bible does two unique things. It affirms capitalism, and even that you don't find in any other holy scriptures. It explicitly affirms the use of capital to generate wealth, the importance of personal responsibility to work hard. It does that, and it also says you've got to underpin this with moral consciousness. You've got to understand that people are actually worth something to me, and they should be worth something to you. That's what God is saying. So the Bible does both of those things. Interestingly, Adam Smith is really well known for The Wealth of Nations. What people don't know is before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote another book, which in my view is far more important, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he talks exactly about this. He talks about the importance of treating people compassionately and lovingly and respectfully. And it's not just because Adam Smith was a Christian, it's also because he was basically sending a warning signal to the world. He's saying, look, I'm about to write another book on markets, and you guys are going to really like that, because it's going to make a lot of people rich. But you have to take both the books together. They're meant to be taken as a 2-volume set. The problem is, since the Second World War, we've kind of forgotten about the theory of moral sentiments, and we've just taken the Wealth of Nations and the invisible hand of the market as kind of our gospel central truth of how we organize our systems, and we've run with that. So even Adam Smith, arguably the discoverer or the first conceiver of free markets in an explicit sense, even he understood the need for morality. The Bible gives us that. It doesn't detract from the importance of markets, but it gives us that morality. So we see on this first point of capital growth that the Bible is a clear declarative statement in support of the banking sector, in support of free market economics, but it also adds moral consciousness to that. And Jürgen Habermas, who's one of the great atheists, he's a German guy, one of the best regarded atheists, certainly in Western scholarship, he famously said, because of this, he said, we owe our entire understanding of 21st century moral consciousness to the Jewish ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. That's from an atheist. So the intellectual history is very, very clear on this. So that's capital growth. But how then, on what basis does the Bible actually say you've got to bring moral consciousness, you've got to care about other people? Because surely if we can just make money and improve our lives and generate more wealth, what does it matter? What does it matter, and why does it matter that we think about how it affects other people? And that's when we come to the second point of intrinsic worth. Because capital growth, if the Bible underpins it with moral consciousness, the question to the Bible, and my question to the Christian faith, would be, okay, on what basis do you claim that? It's all very well and good to say capitalism's good and morality is good, but why? Why morality? We know capitalism's good because it generates wealth. What does morality do? What purpose does it serve? And we come to this second point, which is equally important, of intrinsic worth. Now, here's the interesting thing. All commodities, everything that we trade in banking and in our global commercial system, is traded on it's bought and sold on the principles of supply and demand, right? The freer the market, the more purely those principles operate. So obviously, they're constrained necessarily by things like regulations and other things. But broadly speaking, the purer a market is, the more exclusively supply and demand operates. And what does supply and demand actually do? How does that actually operate? It assigns value and worth to anything tradable, whether it's debt or equity or money, whatever it is. It assigns value based on the scarcity of the good or service or product, and based on the capacity and willingness of the buyer to pay. Right? That's what supply and demand does. So constantly, worth and value is being ascribed based on two things that are always changing. In some sense, supply and demand. They're always changing. They're always contingent on various things. Right? So we know then that the value placed on all things inside our system is extrinsic. Extrinsic means coming from outside. Because the value of any given thing depends on your willingness to pay for it and how many of them I've got and how many competitors I've got selling the same stuff. So those are extrinsic factors. They can always change. A good example of this playing out at the moment, at least in the financial journalism, is in digital currency. Right? All these fintech startups popping up, the whole debate over Bitcoin. Some banks and countries are freaking out and running away from it. Some are kind of stepping towards it slowly, they're not sure. Some are running all guns blazing. And when you of course look at the ascribed worth to digital currency, it's pretty all over the place at the moment. Who knows where it's going to end up? But one of the criticisms is there's no intrinsic value, it's just extrinsic worth. It's just what someone agrees to pay for it. There's no actual intrinsic value. Whereas if you look at a Fortune 200 or a Fortune 500, like your company for example, there is some sense of value and worth in the organization because there are things you can point to, there are tangible assets. Not just the buildings and the desks, but the people who are involved, the goodwill that is involved, the clients and the customers that are involved, the deposits that you guys hold. So there is something intrinsic there. Whereas with something like Bitcoin, for example, it's purely extrinsic, at least at the moment. There's lots of other extrinsic products out there. Things like derivatives, for example, they're all extrinsic too. It's basically people just taking a bet on something, on whether they think the price of this will go up and down. So we see this difference there between intrinsic worth and extrinsic worth. And the honest truth, actually, is that all things inside the system are extrinsically valued. Right? So even the share price of Standard Chartered is extrinsically valued. It all depends on what people out there are willing to pay on any given day. So we could triple overnight or collapse overnight, theoretically. It's very unlikely to happen, but these things are entirely possible. So we see that extrinsic worth is kind of unreliable. It's temporary. It goes up and down. And there's another interesting conversation that Jesus has, and that goes exactly to this point, this idea of intrinsic worth versus extrinsic worth. And he's talking to some of the leaders of the day who hate him. Right? They don't like him, and they're trying to trip him up. They're trying to get him in trouble with the authorities. And so they say to him, hey, do you think people should pay taxes? They're trying to get him to say either no, so he gets in trouble with the Romans, or yes, so he gets in trouble with his supporters who don't like the Romans. And he says something very interesting. He says, show me a coin. And then he says, who's on that coin? Whose face is on that? And the answer, of course, is Caesar, who's the emperor at the time. And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Now, there's a lot of things that he's saying in this statement, right? All of his conversations are incredibly layered. So there's probably 4 layers to that answer. But one of them is Jesus talking about intrinsic and extrinsic worth. The point he is making is that this coin only has value because Caesar gives it value. Caesar recognizes it as a coin. You can't just pick up a rock at that time and say, this rock is worth X number of whatever their denomination of currency they were talking about. You can't just say, this is worth a denarius or this is worth a shekel. For that piece of rock to be worth something, there has to be an external authority from above that comes and gives it value, right, for it to be worth something. And so this is what Jesus is saying. This coin only has value because Caesar has agreed that it has value. And obviously, there's a Roman system. There's a treasury, there's a monetary system where they manufactured these coins and then they would imprint Caesar's face on it and then it would have extrinsic value. Right? And so Jesus is saying this has extrinsic value because of Caesar. The more interesting underlying point is that what he is saying is that it's not until someone from above comes and gives something like that value that that value is recognized and recognizable and intrinsic. So it has to come from the outside to make it intrinsically valuable, because the logical question then is that for Jesus to ask the person asking the question, this coin has Caesar's image on it. Whose image is on you? Whose image is on you? This coin belongs to Caesar. Who do you belong to? And in asking that question, at least implicitly, Jesus is pointing to probably the most beautiful doctrine in the entire Judeo-Christian scriptures, and that is the doctrine of the Imago Dei. The fact that all of us are created in the image of God. And because we are created in the image of God, we all have not just extrinsic value, we have intrinsic worth. Intrinsic worth that can't be taken away by anyone. It can't be taken away by any fluctuations of the financial markets or political revolutions or economic changes or Instagram followers or Twitter followers or even death. Because the intrinsic worth comes from a transcendent place. In the same way that if we were playing a game of Monopoly, that money is worth something in the game of Monopoly. But if I try to take that down to my hawker centre and buy a char siu bao with it, there's no value there because the value is extrinsic. It's only because in the game of Monopoly we agree that this is worth this much money. For that money to actually be worth something at the hawker centre, there would need to be an extrinsic, a transcendent agent that comes and gives that intrinsic value. And in Singapore, that would be the Monetary Authority of Singapore, because that's the only transcendent agent that has the authority and the power to give intrinsic worth to money in this country. Nothing else can do that. The Australian government can't come in and say this monopoly money is worth 2 Sing dollars. It has to be the Monetary Authority of Singapore. It has rightful jurisdiction over all money inside Singapore. In the same way, God, as the creator of the universe, he has rightful jurisdiction over all of us. And he gives us, by making us in his image, intrinsic value and intrinsic worth. You don't see that in any other worldview. No religious or irreligious, theistic or atheistic worldview. The complete and infinite and eternal intrinsic value and worth of all people, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of what we believe, regardless of religion, regardless of physical capability, intellectual capability, disability, sexuality, everything. Complete, eternal, intrinsic worth. So we've seen how the Bible responds to capital growth, positively and with a moral consciousness. We've seen how the Bible responds to intrinsic worth. It's the only place where we can all have our intrinsic value and worth recognized. And then thirdly and finally, what does the Bible have to say about this concept of net present value? Because it's all well and good for God to say, you all have intrinsic worth because you're made in my image. But what's he done about that? How's that been demonstrated? Right? That's just a claim in the end. It's worth nothing unless God has done something about that. Now, those of you who are in the finance area and who are traders and so forth, you will know that in the capital asset pricing model, there are, broadly speaking, 3 kinds of values that we ascribe to equities in determining their level of attractiveness, right? And these values are called beta values. So if an equity has a positive beta value, then it's recognized, generally speaking, that as the markets rise, this stock will rise. And so good examples of these are tech companies. A company like Apple, as the market's doing well, unemployment's down, people have more money, more disposable income, a greater propensity to spend. They're going to be buying things that are not deeply, deeply essential, like $3,000 iPads and $2,000 iPhones, and things that used to be considered crazy. But as things are going well, that's what will happen. That's a positive beta value. There are other companies that have negative beta values. When the market's going down, their price goes up. A good example of this is, well, certainly in Australia, I'm not sure how it works in Singapore. In Australia, when we would go into either recessions or even just a couple of quarters of negative growth, alcohol companies would always spike. People are losing jobs, people are struggling, their marriages are under pressure, so they're drinking more. Probably the Australian drinking culture. So a good place to invest, if the market's falling, is in alcohol stocks. Right? So that's a negative beta value. What every trader is looking for, of course, and what every investor is looking for, is a stock with a neutral beta value. Neutral beta value is what we're looking for, where you can just be confident in the company, confident in the stock price, and you can be confident that that price is going to hold and grow regardless of what the market is doing. It's not driven at all by the market. It's neutral. It's a neutral beta. Now, I'm not a trader, so I don't know if that neutral beta company actually exists. I'm sure the ones that do exist, even then you could make the case that they're not completely immune from the market because they're inside the market. So I don't think there's actually a true neutral beta stock out there. But if you look at what God actually did for us, in recognizing our intrinsic worth, he stepped into the world as a person, Jesus Christ. He went to the cross, he took on all of the anxiety and uncertainty and guilt and shame that we have onto himself, did away with it by dying on the cross, proved who he was, affirming our intrinsic worth and the importance of moral consciousness that he wanted us to have, by rising again from the dead. By doing all of that and offering that to us for free, as a free gift, and all we have to do is say yes to that, and guaranteeing that that freedom from guilt, from shame, from anxiety, from all the things that we've done wrong, all the things that we are scared of, from death itself, by giving us freedom from that and the assurance and guarantee above all of that, regardless of what happens, not just in the markets, but in our families, in our bodies, in our countries, regardless of all of that, he offers the only neutral beta investment. It's the only thing that holds. Every other worldview, whether it's theistic or atheistic, your either salvation or your eternal life or your happiness or your identity or your peace or your fulfillment is all contingent in some way on what you do. Not with the person of Jesus Christ. It's not contingent in any way on what you do. It's completely unaffected by what you do. It's only determined by who you are. So it's not what you think or feel or say or do that makes you a Christian. It's who you are that makes you a Christian. And who you are is determined simply by whether or not you say yes or no to the person of Jesus. It's the best net present value. Net present value is, of course, the figure that we give to investments based on what we think is going to happen down the track. It's all based on contingencies. But all of our models and all of our predictors don't know for sure exactly what's going to happen. They're a pretty good model, and usually they're pretty close at giving us a good idea of what's going to happen, but we can't build our identity on something like that. The moment we build our identity on anything inside the world, whether it's banking or economics or our children or our grandchildren or the education that we have or our technology, as soon as we build our identity on any of those things, we're in positive or negative beta territories. We don't know which way it's going to go. And that's why the entire finance and economics profession and body of scholarship continues to use this Latin phrase, ceteris paribus, all the time when it's talking about its theories and its models. Ceteris paribus in Latin just means all else being equal. So you see economists on TV, you see them on Bloomberg or CNN or Channel News Asia, and you ask them, you know, what's going to happen if this happens? And they will say, well, look, all else being equal, this is what will happen. Because they don't know what else is going to happen. There's so many uncertainties in life. We just don't know. We don't know what a health crisis within our family can do. We don't know what a drunk driver or someone texting that makes a wrong turn can just change our entire lives, can change our entire families, can change our entire status of who we are. Let alone things like economic fluctuations and political revolutions and job losses and offshoring and all of those things. So what's clear, and again we look back to the words of Jesus himself, and he says again, in relation to him as the only neutral beta investment, the only safe investment, he says, don't store up for yourself treasures here on earth where moth and rust consume and thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourself treasures in heaven where moth and rust don't consume, where thieves can't break in and steal. He's basically saying, if you say yes to a relationship with me, you become effectively invincible. Invincible to the markets, invincible to the weather, invincible to health crises, invincible to death itself. Invincible to everything inside this closed system. So don't build your identity and your fulfillment on any of these things. Build it in your relationship with me, and then all of these things will become a lot more fun. They'll become a lot more fun, they'll become a lot more joyous, they'll become a lot more rewarding. You can go out there and work hard and enjoy the blessings of your work, and you can embrace capitalism, and you can grow your wealth and send your kids to good schools and enjoy all of that, knowing that that's not the most important thing, but that your identity in me, which lasts well beyond this life, is the most important thing. So whichever way we look at it, those were three very simple concepts of banking that I took. Capital growth, intrinsic worth, and net present value. And I know there are like 500 others. I have no doubt if we went down the list, in the dictionary of finance or the dictionary of banking, there would be equivalent transposable principles that we could point to through the person of Jesus Christ. Because God himself made us, wants what's best for us, knows us, and extends us that offer of relationship that provides us with a basis for our identity and our fulfillment that transcends not just banking, not just material wealth, but transcends absolutely everything that we see in our material world. Thanks so much for listening. Yeah, I mean.